The camera shows an old black and white photo of a small, skinny man wearing a fancy suit. His eyes are covered by wire-rimmed glasses. You can't tell what he's thinking from his face. There's no emotion, no sign of the huge criminal world he built or the harm he caused. What if I told you that this quiet man who looked like a bookworm controlled more money than most countries? That he helped the United States win World War II, while also making American cities more corrupt from one coast to the other? That he changed organized crime from a bunch of street thugs into a smart business that would shape American culture for many years? This is Meyer Lansky, born Meyer Sokoljanski in a Polish village. He would later be called the mob's accountant, a math genius who changed American organized crime from rough violence into careful profit. While Al Capone was in the news with machine guns and street shootings, Lansky worked in the shadows, building an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars without ever spending a long time in prison. Here's something most people don't know. The FBI spent 50 years trying to catch him and mostly failed. When he died in 1983, agents were still looking for the hundreds of millions they thought he had hidden around the world. They never found it. The camera stops on a photo of 8-year-old Meyer Lansky, who had just arrived at Ellis Island. He is holding a small cloth bag with everything his family owned in America. The boy in this picture would grow up to become one of the most powerful and mysterious people in American crime history. Before we go into this amazing story, I want to ask you something. Look in the comments below and tell me where you are watching this from, and what time it is where you are right now. I'm curious to see how far this story reaches around the world. And if you like learning about hidden stories from American history, the kind they don't teach in school, make sure to subscribe and click the bell for notifications. Trust me, what you are about to learn about Meyer Lansky will change how you think about organized crime, American business, and the thin line between legal and illegal power. Now let's start at the start, in a place that doesn't exist anymore, during a time when staying alive mattered more than getting ahead. The year was 1902, and in the factory city of Grodno, which was then part of the Russian Empire and is now in Belarus, a son was born to Max and Yetta Sokoljanski. They named him Meyer after Yetta's father. The Sokoljanskis were Jewish and lived under the harsh rules of Tsarist Russia. Stuck in the Pale of Settlement, an area where Jewish people were allowed to live but never truly accepted. Max Sokoljanski worked as a laborer, his hands always stained from whatever jobs he could find. The family lived in a small, crowded apartment they shared with another family, with only a hanging sheet to separate them. Having privacy was a luxury they couldn't afford. Along with enough food, warm clothes, and basic medical care, young Meyer showed signs of being very smart from an early age. While other kids played in the muddy streets, he would sit quietly, watching, thinking, and figuring things out. His mother noticed he could add and subtract before he could write his name properly. More importantly, he seemed to understand people, what motivated them, what their weaknesses were, and what they wanted. The Sokoljanski family lived in constant fear. Organized attacks on Jewish towns swept through the Russian Empire regularly. Max had survived one such attack as a child, watching his own father get beaten badly by drunk peasants while the police did nothing. The memory haunted him, and he was determined that his children would not go through such terror. In 1909, when Meyer was 7 years old, Max made the choice that would change everything. He would take his family to America, the golden land where Jewish people could live freely and kids could grow up without fear. But moving required money they didn't have, and the process was risky and unsure. So Max started saving every penny taking extra jobs when he could, going without food so his family could eat. Yetta sold the few pieces of jewelry she had inherited from her mother. Slowly and painfully, they gathered the money needed for the trip to America. The journey would split the family. Max would go first, get settled, and then send for his wife and children. In 1911, Max Sokoljansky left Grodno forever. He carried with him his family's hopes and the address of a distant cousin in New York's Lower East Side who had promised to help him find work. The plan was simple. Max would work, save money, and bring his family to America within 2 years. But plans rarely go the way you expect. For 9-year-old Meyer, his father being gone was both scary and freeing, without Max there to protect them. The family became more open to the growing attacks on Jewish people sweeping through the Russian Empire. Yetta worked as a seamstress, her fingers bleeding from long hours with a needle and thread, earning just enough to keep the family from starving. Meyer learned to get around the dangerous streets of Grodno with the skill of someone much older. He discovered that information was valuable, knowing which streets to stay away from, which officials could be paid off, which shopkeepers might give credit to a Jewish family. He started running small errands for neighbors, earning small coins that he carefully saved. More importantly, he learned to watch without being noticed. The small, thin boy with big eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses became almost invisible, able to listen in on grown-up talks, to see how powerful and powerless people interacted, to understand the unwritten rules that controlled his world. During this time, Meyer had his first experience with organized crime. Though he wouldn't realize it for many years, local crime bosses, many of them Jewish, ran various illegal activities in Grodno, like smuggling, gambling, and lending money. They offered protection to Jewish businesses, collected debts, and settled arguments, while the official government treated Jewish people as second-class citizens. These criminal operations offered a separate power system where being smart and cunning mattered more than social status. Young Meyer was fascinated by these men. They dressed better than his father, were respected, and seemed safe from the random violence that affected ordinary Jews. He started to understand that in a world where the law offered no protection, the people who made their own rules held real power. In 1914, as World War I broke out across Europe, life in Grodno became even harder. Food shortages got worse, violence increased, and talking to America became almost impossible. The Sokoljanskys hadn't heard from Max in months, and had no way to know if he was alive or dead. Yetta made a desperate choice to take her children and run to America. With or without knowing Max was there to meet them, she sold everything they owned, borrowed money, and in the spring of 1914 began the trip that would take them from Grodno to Hamburg, then across the Atlantic Ocean to Ellis Island. The journey was a nightmare of packed ships, sickness, and worry. 12-year-old Meyer helped take care of his younger siblings while his mother fought seasickness and hopelessness. He watched passengers die from illness and saw bodies wrapped in sheets dropped into the ocean. But he also watched how the ship's crew worked, who had real authority, how choices were made, how information and favors were traded. When the ship finally arrived in New York Harbor and the Statue of Liberty came into view, Meyer Sokoljansky felt no special joy or relief. Instead, he felt a cold, hard determination. He had spent the ocean crossing thinking about chances. How likely it was that his father was alive, that they would be let into America, that they would survive in this new world. Ellis Island was chaos. Thousands of immigrants were processed every day, many of whom spoke no English and carried sicknesses that could get them sent back immediately. Families were split up, papers were lost, and the future hung on the choices of rushed immigration officials. When their turn came, Yetta held her children close as an immigration officer looked at their papers. Sokoljansky, the officer said, struggling to say it. That's quite a mouthful. How about we make it easier? With a few pen strokes, the family name became Lansky, Meyer Sokoljansky. A scared boy from Grodno stopped existing. In his place stood Meyer Lansky, an American immigrant, meant to become one of the most powerful criminals in United States history. The change was more than just a new name. As Meyer walked out of Ellis Island and into America, he carried with him lessons learned in the harsh school of Eastern European hatred of Jews. That to survive you needed intelligence over strength. That loyalty was the most valuable thing you could have. That the official authorities often protected the people who least deserved it. Most importantly, he understood that in America, as in Russia, true power belonged to those willing to work outside the law, but with much smarter methods than the simple violence he had seen in Grodno. The reunion with Max was emotional, but quick. The man who had left Grodno 3 years earlier was now a stranger, worn down by factory work, speaking broken English mixed with Yiddish, living in a crowded apartment that was hardly bigger than their room in Grodno. Max had found work in a sweatshop, earning barely enough to survive, let alone support a family. The golden land had turned out to be less golden than promised. The Lansky family settled into life on the Lower East Side, one of the most crowded places in human history. Hester Street, where they lived, was a mix of sounds from Yiddish, Italian, Chinese, Irish, along with street sellers, crying kids, and the elevated train that ran above, blocking out the sun. Their apartment was on the 4th floor with no running water, no electricity, and no heat except from the coal stove in the kitchen. 7 people lived in 3 rooms, with Meyer and his brothers sleeping on the floor. Privacy didn't exist. Sanitation was basic. And sickness spread quickly through the crowded buildings. But for Meyer, the Lower East Side was a school. Every street corner was a classroom where he could watch how America really worked. He watched Italian immigrants form tight groups that offered each other protection and money-making chances. He saw Irish cops who could be paid off or scared. He noticed Chinese shopkeepers who kept up complicated business ties based on trust and family duties. Most importantly, he started to understand that in America, unlike Russia, there were chances for people who were smart enough and tough enough to grab them. The country was growing fast, creating new industries, new wealth, and new ways to take advantage of both legal and illegal chances. Meyer's formal education began at PS 34, a packed elementary school where immigrant children were processed through a system meant to turn them into Americans as quickly as possible. Meyer did well in school, especially in math, but he was also learning lessons that weren't part of the official lessons. The schoolyard was a small version of the bigger society. Different ethnic groups fought for space and status. Alliances were made and broken based on mutual benefit. And violence was always a possibility. Meyer, small for his age and clearly smart, became a target for bullies who saw him as an easy victim. This was where Meyer Lansky first showed the mix of intelligence and toughness that would define his criminal life. Instead of fighting his tormentors directly, a fight he would surely lose, he started gathering information about them. He learned their schedules, their weaknesses, their family situations. Then he started to use that information when Tony Rizzoli, a bigger boy who had been taking Meyer's lunch money, found himself surrounded by a group of Irish boys who had somehow learned that Tony's father was a strikebreaker. Meyer watched from a safe distance as Tony got a beating far worse than any he had ever given. The Irish boys had been given Tony's schedule and told exactly where to find him by an anonymous note. Meyer never faced Tony directly, never threatened him, never even talked to him about what happened. But Tony never bothered him again. More importantly, other possible bullies started giving the quiet boy with glasses plenty of space. There was something unsettling about someone who could cause violence without taking part in it. This event taught Meyer several important lessons that would guide his criminal life. Information was power. Acting indirectly was often more effective than facing things head-on. And a reputation, carefully managed, could be more valuable than physical strength. As Meyer moved through elementary school, his math skills became famous among both students and teachers. He could do complex calculations in his head, understand probability better than most adults, and see patterns that others missed. But his teachers also noticed something troubling. Meyer showed little interest in activities that didn't help him directly. While other kids played games for fun, Meyer only played games that involved betting. While other students made friends based on shared interests, Meyer built relationships that gave him specific advantages. Even at age 12, he was starting to think like a businessman, just one whose business operated outside legal limits. The change of Meyer Sokoljansky into Meyer Lansky was almost complete. The scared immigrant boy had become a calculating teenager who understood that in America, success belonged to those willing to take it. The question was not whether Meyer would get involved in crime, which seemed certain given who he was and his situation, but rather how smart and powerful his criminal business would become. The answer to that question would start to show itself when Meyer met another immigrant boy who would become his closest friend, most trusted partner, and eventually his most necessary sacrifice. The meeting that would change the course of American organized crime happened on a dusty playground at P.S. 34 in the spring of 1918. Meyer Lansky, now 16 and getting ready to leave school to help support his family, was running a small dice game behind the school building. He had learned that immigrant boys always had a few pennies they were willing to risk for a chance to win more. And Meyer had figured out the odds carefully enough to make sure he usually won. On this particular day, a new boy approached the game. He was taller than Meyer, with striking blue eyes and wide shoulders that suggested he would grow into a strong man. Where Meyer was careful and calculating, this boy gave off an almost careless energy. He watched the dice game for several minutes, studying not the dice, but Meyer himself. "You're running a crooked game," the boy said finally, his voice carrying a slight accent that Meyer recognized as similar to his own Eastern European sound, but different. "The dice are loaded." The other boys in the game looked nervously between Meyer and this newcomer. Meyer himself stayed perfectly calm. Though his mind was racing, the dice were indeed loaded, but in a subtle way that he hadn't expected anyone to notice. "That's a serious accusation," Meyer said quietly. "You sure you want to make it?" The boy smiled, and Meyer realized he wasn't being threatened. He was being tested. "I'm sure. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Meyer thought about his choices. He could deny it, but this boy clearly knew better. He could get angry and defensive, but that would only prove what the boy suspected. Instead, Meyer did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He laughed. "You're right," he said, putting the dice in his pocket. "But nobody else figured it out. That means you and I might have something to talk about." The boy held out his hand. "Benjamin Siegel," he said, "but everyone calls me Bugsy." "Though not to my face if they're smart." Meyer shook his hand. "Meyer Lansky. And I'm always smart." That handshake marked the start of a partnership that would last more than 30 years and help create the modern American crime syndicate. But in the spring of 1918, they were just two immigrant boys who saw something valuable in each other. Bugsy Siegel had arrived in New York 2 years earlier with his family, running from the same hatred of Jewish people that had driven the Lanskys from Eastern Europe. But where Meyer's family had come from Poland, the Siegels were from Austria-Hungary. More importantly, where Meyer had learned to survive through intelligence and planning, Bugsy had learned to survive through physical strength and a nearly mindless willingness to use violence. The two boys were natural matches. Meyer had the brains to plan complicated schemes, while Bugsy had the physical presence to make their will happen when planning wasn't enough. Meyer understood probability and could figure out odds, while Bugsy understood human nature and could read people's intentions. Meyer was cautious and methodical, while Bugsy was impulsive and charming. Together, they started to explore the possibilities that New York's Lower East Side offered to two smart, ambitious boys with no respect for regular authority. Their first partnership was simple but profitable. Meyer had noticed that certain stores got deliveries of valuable goods at regular times. Often, when only one worker was there, Bugsy would create a distraction, usually by starting an argument with another customer, while Meyer would quickly look at the merchandise and spot items that could be easily sold again. They weren't exactly stealing instead. They were gathering information that they would sell to other boys who were more willing to take the physical risks of actually stealing. Meyer and Bugsy became information brokers, giving detailed reports in exchange for a share of whatever their clients managed to steal. This arrangement taught both boys important lessons about criminal organization. Meyer learned that the person who plans the crime and gives the information often makes more money than the person who does it, with much less risk of arrest or violence. Bugsy learned that physical force was most effective when it was used precisely at exactly the right moment as part of a bigger plan. More importantly, they learned to trust each other completely. In their world, betrayal meant prison or death, so loyalty became the foundation of their relationship. They created a code of conduct that would guide their partnership for decades. Never lie to each other. Never act without talking to each other about important matters. And never let personal relationships get in the way of business decisions. By 1919, Meyer and Bugsy had grown their operations a lot. They were running several dice games throughout the Lower East Side. Each one carefully managed to make steady profits without attracting police attention. They had also started lending money to other immigrants at interest rates that were high but not too high, at least by their neighborhood standards. Meyer's math skills proved very useful in the lending business. He could figure out compound interest in his head, judge how likely a borrower was to pay back a loan based on their job and family situation, and set up payment plans that maximized profits while minimizing people not paying back. Bugsy's role in the lending business was more direct. When someone didn't make payments, Bugsy would visit them personally. He rarely had to actually use violence. His reputation for being unpredictable, combined with his strong physical presence, usually convinced people in debt to find the money they owed. The partnership was profitable enough that both boys were able to give significant money to their families, which raised their status in the immigrant community. Meyer's parents started to view his business activities with a mix of pride and worry. They were grateful for the money, but concerned about how he was earning it. Bugsy's family had a different reaction. His father, who worked in construction, was impressed by his son's business sense and saw nothing wrong with bending rules to get ahead in America. This difference in family attitudes would affect both boys' future paths. Meyer would always feel some tension between his criminal activities and his family's wish for respectability. While Bugsy would see crime as just another form of business in early 1920, their informal partnership became what was known on the streets as the Bugs and Meyer mob. The name was a bit misleading. They weren't really a mob in the traditional sense, but rather a small criminal business focused on gambling, lending money, and selling information. The Bugs and Meyer mob operated according to principles that Meyer had developed by carefully watching other criminal groups. They kept strict discipline among their workers, never tolerated betrayal or careless talk, and always paid their debts promptly. They avoided unnecessary violence, but when violence was necessary, it was used quickly and decisively. Most importantly, they studied successful legal businesses and copied their organizational methods. Meyer insisted on keeping detailed financial records. Even though doing so created potential evidence against them, he wanted to know exactly how much money they were making, where it was coming from, and where it was going. This analytical approach set the Bugs and Meyer mob apart from other street gangs, which tended to act on impulse and immediate pleasure, while other criminals spent their profits as fast as they earned them. Meyer and Bugsy put their earnings back into growing their operations. By the summer of 1920, they had enough money to make a big investment in what would become the most profitable criminal business in American history: bootlegging, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, which made it illegal to make, sell, or move alcoholic drinks, had been approved in January 1919. The Volstead Act, which set up ways to enforce Prohibition, went into effect on January 17, 1920. Most Americans, including many law enforcement officials, thought Prohibition was a short-term experiment that would eventually be undone. What they didn't understand was that by making a product that millions of Americans wanted to consume illegal, they had created the largest black market in human history. Meyer Lansky understood this right away on the day the Volstead Act started. He told Bugsy, "We just became millionaires. We just don't know it yet." Meyer had figured out that Americans drank about 2 billion gallons of alcoholic drinks every year before Prohibition. Even if drinking dropped by 50%, which seemed unlikely, there would still be a market for 1 billion gallons of illegal alcohol every year. More importantly, Meyer realized that the alcohol trade would require exactly the skills that he and Bugsy had been developing: careful planning, reliable ways to move products, protection from competitors, and the ability to bribe public officials. Their start in bootlegging was modest. They bought industrial alcohol from a chemical company, hired a local chemist to help them turn it into something like whiskey, and sold their product to local bars at a large markup. The operation was profitable right away. But Meyer was already thinking several steps ahead. Industrial alcohol was expensive and risky to change. Real whiskey needed time to age properly. But there was another source of alcohol that was both legal and easy to get: medicinal alcohol prescribed by doctors for treatment. Meyer started building relationships with doctors who were willing to write prescriptions for medicinal alcohol in exchange for cash. He also made connections with pharmacists who would sell prescription alcohol without asking too many questions about the patients who supposedly needed it. This approach had several benefits. The alcohol was better quality than their homemade product. The legal risk was lower because they were technically dealing with legal prescriptions, and the profit margins were huge. But Meyer's real insight was realizing that bootlegging would eventually attract violent competition. As profits grew, more criminals would enter the market, leading to fights over territory, price wars, and street battles that would eventually draw law enforcement attention and lower everyone's profits. The solution, Meyer realized, was organization. Instead of fighting competitors, They needed to work with them. Instead of destructive competition, they needed to set up territories, set prices, and create ways to solve arguments without violence. In the summer of 1920, Meyer arranged a meeting with several other criminal groups working in Lower Manhattan. The meeting took place in the back room of a restaurant owned by an Italian immigrant who had been running illegal gambling for years. Meyer's idea was simple, but new. Instead of fighting each other for customers, they should divide the territory by area, agree on wholesale prices, and create a system for sharing information about police activities. Most of the older criminals dismissed Meyer as a naive teenager who didn't understand how the real world worked. But a few listened carefully to his presentation, especially when he showed them detailed financial projections showing how much more money everyone could make by working together instead of competing. Among those who listened was a young Italian-American criminal named Charles Luciano, who would later become known as Lucky Luciano. Like Meyer, Lucky understood that the old ways of doing business, based on ethnic loyalty and simple violence, were not efficient and would eventually cause their own downfall. The meeting ended without any formal agreements, but Meyer had planted seeds that would eventually grow into the National Crime Syndicate, the most advanced criminal organization in American history. More immediately, the meeting established Meyer and Bugsy as serious players in the New York criminal underworld. They were no longer just neighborhood hustlers running dice games for pocket change. They were becoming major figures in a business that would soon be worth hundreds of millions of dollars every year. As 1920 ended, Meyer Lansky was 18 years old. He had dropped out of school, was giving more to his family's income than his father, and was starting to build real wealth for the first time in his life. He had also started to develop the way of thinking that would guide his criminal career. Violence was a tool to be used carefully and strategically. Intelligence was more valuable than strength, and the most successful criminals were those who thought like business people rather than thugs. The change of Meyer Lansky from immigrant boy to criminal mastermind was speeding up, but the young man who had once been Meyer Sokoljansky still carried within him the memories of being treated badly in Eastern Europe, the knowledge that safety and security could disappear overnight, and the determination never again to be powerless against forces he couldn't control. These memories and lessons would shape every choice he made as his criminal empire grew from a few blocks in Lower Manhattan to include operations across the United States and around the world. The change of America into a criminal paradise began at midnight on January 17, 1920, as the Volstead Act took effect, making it illegal to make, sell, or move alcoholic drinks. Meyer Lansky stood on the roof of a crowded building on Hester Street, looking out over the lights of Manhattan. Bugsy Siegel stood beside him. Both young men understood that they were watching a historic moment that would define their futures. So what happens now? Bugsy asked. Meyer's answer would prove to be true. Now we get rich. But Meyer understood that getting rich from Prohibition would require more than just selling illegal alcohol. It would require creating an entirely new kind of criminal business, one that could work on a national scale, bribe government officials at every level, and protect itself against both law enforcement and criminal competitors. Within 6 months of Prohibition starting, the Bugs and Meyer mob had grown from a small neighborhood operation into a sophisticated criminal organization. They controlled bootlegging from the Lower East Side to Brooklyn, employed more than 50 people, and made profits that were more than the yearly budgets of many small cities. The key to their fast growth was Meyer's realization that bootlegging was ultimately a business about moving goods. Success depended not on making the best alcohol, but on moving large amounts of alcohol from makers to customers efficiently and safely. This required trucks, warehouses, ways to distribute, and most importantly, protection from law enforcement. Meyer approached bootlegging like a mathematician solving a complex problem. He figured out that the average bar in Manhattan needed about 50 gallons of alcohol per week to stay profitable. Manhattan had about 32,000 bars by 1925, meaning the borough alone needed 16 million gallons of illegal alcohol every week. But Meyer also figured out the risks. Federal agents were seizing about 10% of all illegal alcohol shipments. Police corruption varied by area, with some cops demanding bribes of up to 20% of total earnings. Violence between competing bootlegging operations was increasing, creating extra costs for security and reducing overall profit. The solution was controlling everything from start to finish. Instead of just buying alcohol from makers and selling it to bars, Meyer and Bugsy started controlling every part of the supply chain. They set up relationships with Canadian distilleries that could provide high-quality whiskey. They bought a fleet of trucks for moving goods. With drivers who were insured against arrest, they rented warehouses throughout the tri-state area, each one managed by trusted workers who kept detailed inventory records. Most importantly, they started systematically bribing law enforcement officials at every level. Meyer's approach to police corruption was typically methodical. Instead of trying to bribe individual officers one by one, which was expensive and unreliable, he identified key people within police departments and offered them regular monthly payments in exchange for early warning about raids and enforcement activities. The amounts involved were large. A police captain might receive $1,500 monthly, more than his official salary, for providing information about planned raids in his area. Federal agents, who were generally more honest but also more poorly paid, could often be convinced to look the other way for payments of $200 to $300 per incident. But Meyer's real innovation was realizing that successful corruption required more than just money. It required understanding what individual officials needed beyond cash. Some police officers wanted their children to go to better schools and were willing to accept educational scholarships that were actually bribes. Others had gambling debts that could be forgiven in exchange for cooperation. Still others wanted business opportunities for their relatives, which could be provided through seemingly legal jobs in Lansky's businesses. This sophisticated approach to corruption allowed the Bugs and Meyer mob to operate with almost no risk in their main areas. While other bootlegging operations lost big parts of their shipments to police raids, Meyer and Bugsy rarely lost a truck or a warehouse. Their success attracted attention from other criminal groups, especially the Italian-American groups that had traditionally ruled organized crime in New York. These groups, led by older men who had moved from Sicily and southern Italy, initially viewed Jewish criminals like Meyer and Bugsy as small players who could be ignored or easily removed. This attitude proved to be a serious mistake. In the fall of 1921, representatives from the Mafia crime family approached Meyer with what they called a business offer. Giuseppe Joe the Boss, Mafia, controlled significant criminal operations throughout Manhattan and Brooklyn, including illegal gambling, labor racketeering, and bootlegging. His representatives told Meyer that the Bugs and Meyer mob would now operate under Mafia's protection in exchange for 50% of their total earnings. Meyer listened politely to this offer, asked several questions about the specific terms, and requested 48 hours to think about it. The Mafia representatives agreed, thinking Meyer's careful response meant he understood how serious their position was. They were right about the seriousness, but wrong about Meyer's response. Instead of accepting Mafia's terms, Meyer immediately started planning what would become one of the most sophisticated criminal campaigns in American history. His goal was not simply to resist Maseria's demands, but to show that Jewish criminals could be as organized, as tough, and as strategically smart as their Italian counterparts. Meyer's first move was gathering information. He assigned workers to watch Maseria's operations, identifying key people, ways they moved goods, warehouse locations, and patterns of police corruption. Within 2 weeks, he had detailed profiles of Maseria's top helpers, including their personal habits, family relationships, and financial weaknesses. His second move was building alliances. Meyer arranged meetings with other criminal groups that had been pressured by Masseria, including Irish gangs from Hell's Kitchen and Jewish groups from Brooklyn and the Bronx. Rather than suggesting a direct alliance against Masseria, Meyer proposed a mutual help agreement. Each group would give information and occasional support to the others, but would stay operationally independent. His third move was the most dangerous: direct action against Masseria's operations. On November 15, 1921, 3 Masseria trucks carrying Canadian whiskey were hijacked at the same time in different parts of Manhattan. The drivers were not hurt, but the trucks and their cargo, worth about $50,000, disappeared completely. No demand for money was made, and no one said they were responsible for the thefts 2 days later. A Masseria warehouse in Brooklyn was robbed during the night. Again, no violence was used, but the thieves took nearly $100,000 worth of alcohol and left behind a handwritten note, compliments of the management. Masseria's response was quick and brutal. He ordered his soldiers to get back at Jewish criminals throughout New York, leading to a series of shootings, beatings, and bombings that made headlines in every newspaper in the city. But Meyer had expected this reaction. Instead of responding with similar violence, he used a strategy that showed his sophisticated understanding of both criminal psychology and media manipulation. Every act of violence by Masseria's men was carefully recorded and reported to newspaper reporters, who had been befriended by Meyer's workers. Police officials who had been bribed by Meyer suddenly became very interested in investigating Italian-American criminal activities. Federal agents received anonymous tips about Masseria's warehouse locations and transportation schedules. Within a month, Masseria had lost more money to police raids than he had lost to the original hijackings. More importantly, his reputation for being unbeatable had been hurt, leading some of his own workers to question his leadership. The war between Masseria and the Bugs and Meyer mob continued for 6 months, but it was fought according to Meyer's rules rather than traditional criminal methods. While Masseria relied on violence and threats, Meyer used information, psychological tactics, and strategic corruption. The conflict ended not with a dramatic shootout, but with a business meeting in May 1922. Representatives from both sides met in the back room of a restaurant in Little Italy to discuss terms for peaceful coexistence. Masseria, who had lost significant money and respect during the conflict, agreed to recognize the Bugs and Meyer mob as an independent group with territorial rights in Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn. In exchange, Meyer agreed to pay Masseria a small amount, not the 50% originally demanded, but a token sum that acknowledged Masseria's seniority without giving up operational independence. More importantly, the agreement set principles that would guide relationships between different criminal groups for decades. Territorial boundaries would be respected. Disputes would be solved through discussion rather than violence when possible, and cooperation in areas of mutual benefit would be encouraged. The end of the Masseria conflict established Meyer Lansky as a major figure in New York's criminal underworld. At age 20, he controlled operations that made hundreds of thousands of dollars annually and employed dozens of people. But Meyer understood that his success during Prohibition was just the beginning of what could be done through intelligent criminal organization. His vision went far beyond bootlegging. He saw criminal groups that could work across state lines, bribe officials at the federal level, and build business relationships with legal companies. He saw the potential for creating an American version of the Sicilian Mafia, but one that would be more sophisticated, more disciplined, and ultimately more powerful than its European forerunner. The first step toward making this vision real was expanding beyond New York. In 1923, Meyer and Bugsy started setting up operations in other cities, beginning with Philadelphia and then moving to Boston, Detroit, and Cleveland. Each new city required months of preparation, finding local partners, understanding law enforcement structures, and figuring out the specific opportunities and risks that local conditions created. Philadelphia proved especially profitable because of its closeness to both New York and the Canadian border. Meyer set up warehouse facilities in industrial areas outside the city, staffed by local workers who understood regional police patterns. The Philadelphia operation also introduced Meyer to an idea that would become central to his criminal philosophy: the importance of having legal business fronts. Instead of operating warehouses that existed only for illegal purposes, Meyer began buying or renting facilities that did actual legal business during the day and stored illegal goods only at night. This approach had several benefits. It raised less suspicion from law enforcement, created legal income that could be reported on tax returns, and built business relationships with legal companies that could be useful for future operations. By 1924, the Bugs and Meyer mob was working in 7 cities and making more than $1 million annually in total earnings, equal to about $15 million today. But Meyer was already planning for the end of Prohibition, knowing that constitutional amendments could be undone just as easily as they had been put in place. The key insight that set Meyer apart from other bootleggers was his understanding that Prohibition was temporary, but the organizational methods developed during Prohibition could be permanent. The bribery networks, the distribution systems, the territorial agreements, and the business relationships they had created could be used for other criminal activities. Long after alcohol became legal again, Meyer started diversifying his operations as early as 1924, setting up illegal gambling that used the same territorial organization and bribery networks developed for bootlegging. He also started exploring labor racketeering, realizing that labor unions offered chances for both legal and illegal profit. But his most important innovation during this period was developing money laundering techniques that would allow criminal profits to be turned into apparently legal wealth. Meyer's approach to money laundering was typically systematic. He built relationships with bankers who would accept large cash deposits without asking detailed questions about where it came from. He bought legal businesses, restaurants, clothing stores, taxi companies, that could provide believable explanations for large amounts of cash. Most importantly, he started investing criminal profits in real estate, stocks, and bonds, creating a collection of legal assets that could support a middle-class lifestyle even if his criminal operations were disrupted. This financial sophistication set Meyer apart from almost every other criminal of his time. While most bootleggers spent their profits on fancy cars, jewelry, and lavish parties, Meyer was building long-term wealth that could survive changes in law enforcement priorities or criminal market conditions. The period from 1922 to 1925 changed Meyer Lansky from a street-smart teenager into one of the most sophisticated criminal organizers in American history. But it also taught him lessons about the limits of criminal power and the importance of political relationships that would shape his approach to organized crime for the rest of his career. The most important lesson came from watching how Prohibition was actually enforced. Despite the Volstead Act's theoretical completeness, actual enforcement varied dramatically depending on local political conditions. In some cities, federal agents conducted aggressive raids and prosecuted violators seriously. In others, local police openly ignored bootlegging operations or took part in them directly. Meyer realized that criminal success ultimately depended on political success. The most profitable criminal groups would be those that could influence elections, bribe judges, and build relationships with legal political leaders. This insight would guide Meyer's activities for the next decade as he worked to change American organized crime from a collection of competing gangs into a sophisticated political and economic force that could work openly with legal institutions. The year 1925 marked a turning point in Meyer Lansky's growth from successful bootlegger to criminal visionary. As he approached his 23rd birthday, Meyer controlled operations that spanned 8 cities and made more than $2 million annually. But more importantly, he had started to develop the philosophical and organizational principles that would change American organized crime. The change began with a realization that came from careful analysis of his own operations. Meyer had noticed that while his bootlegging business made huge amounts of money, his actual profit was lower than it should be due to inefficiency, theft by workers, and poor coordination between different parts of the operation. Traditional criminal groups dealt with these problems through violence and threats. Workers who stole were beaten or killed. Inefficient operations were abandoned rather than improved, and coordination problems were ignored as long as overall money kept growing. Meyer chose a different approach. He started applying systematic business analysis to criminal operations using techniques he had seen in legal companies and adapting them to the unique challenges of illegal businesses. The first step was a complete financial analysis. Meyer hired an accountant, a straight-laced immigrant from Germany who believed he was working for a legal import-export business, to examine his books and find where profit could be improved. The accountant's report was revealing. Nearly 30% of total earnings were being lost to worker theft, inefficient transportation, and poor inventory management. Coordination problems between different cities meant that alcohol was sometimes shipped to places where it wasn't needed, while other markets had shortages. Most seriously, the lack of standard pricing meant that different parts of the organization were competing against each other, lowering profits for everyone. Meyer's response was to put in place the most sophisticated management system ever developed for a criminal organization. He set up standard procedures for every part of his operations, from buying and transportation to distribution and collecting payments. He created detailed financial reporting requirements that let him check the performance of every operational unit in real time. Most importantly, he started treating his criminal workers like corporate executives rather than street thugs. Key people received regular salaries rather than just shares of profits, creating reasons to think long-term rather than just grabbing short-term gains. Performance bonuses were given based on clear criteria like efficiency and reliability, rather than just loyalty or toughness. This systematic approach to management attracted the attention of other organized crime figures, especially a young Italian-American criminal named Charles Lucky Luciano, who was facing similar challenges in his own operations. Lucky Luciano was everything that Meyer Lansky was not: tall, handsome, charming, and physically intimidating. But like Meyer, Lucky understood that the old methods of criminal organization based on ethnic loyalty, family connections, and simple violence, were not enough for the opportunities that Prohibition had created. The meeting between Meyer and Lucky in the spring of 1925 was arranged by mutual acquaintances who realized that both men were developing ideas that could benefit from working together. The meeting took place in the back room of a restaurant in Little Italy, with only the two of them present. Lucky started the conversation with a direct question. "I hear you're running your operation like a real business. Is that true?" Meyer's response was typically precise. "I'm running it like a profitable business. Whether it's real depends on your definition of reality." What followed was a 6-hour conversation that would reshape American organized crime. Lucky described the problems he was facing with traditional Italian crime families, which were led by older men who had moved from Sicily and brought with them old grudges, strict hierarchies, and operational methods that were becoming outdated in modern America. These mustache Petes, as younger criminals called them, insisted on keeping old-world traditions that limited their effectiveness. They refused to work with non-Italians. They avoided businesses they considered dishonorable, without having a clear definition of what honor meant. And they solved disputes through violence that drew law enforcement attention and lowered everyone's profits. Meyer listened carefully to Lucky's description of these problems, then asked a question that showed his strategic thinking. What would happen if the mustache Petes were no longer in charge? Lucky's answer was immediate. Younger guys could run things more efficiently, make more money for everyone, reduce violence, operate more like legal businesses. Meyer nodded. And what would it take to make that happen? The conversation that followed laid the groundwork for what would become known as the Castellammarese War, a conflict that would remove the old guard of Italian, American organized crime and replace it with a new generation of leaders who shared Meyer's vision of criminal organization. But the alliance between Meyer and Lucky was based on more than just mutual business interests. Both men realized that the future of organized crime lay not in ethnic separation, but in cooperation between different groups. Jewish criminals like Meyer brought financial sophistication and political connections, while Italian criminals like Lucky provided organizational discipline and territorial control. Together, they started developing what would become known as the National Crime Syndicate, a partnership of criminal groups that would divide territories, coordinate activities, and solve disputes without the destructive violence that had marked traditional criminal competition. The first test of this alliance came in late 1925 when a territorial dispute arose between Meyer's operations and those of Joe the Baker Catania, an old-style Italian crime boss who controlled bootlegging in parts of Brooklyn. Catania had started taking Meyer's trucks and threatening his workers, apparently believing that Jewish criminals would not fight back effectively against Italian-American gangsters. His mistake was based on outdated ideas about ethnic hierarchies and organized crime. Meyer's response showed the sophisticated approach to criminal conflict that would become his trademark. Instead of fighting back directly, he gathered detailed information about Catania's operations, found weaknesses, and developed a complete plan for removing the threat without creating publicity or drawing law enforcement attention. The campaign against Catania lasted 3 months and involved no shootings, bombings, or other dramatic violence. Instead, Meyer systematically weakened Catania's business through a combination of economic pressure, political manipulation, and psychological warfare. Key suppliers who provided Catania with Canadian whiskey suddenly found their shipments caught by federal agents who had received anonymous tips about transportation schedules and routes. Police officials who had been protecting Catania's operations were transferred to different areas after complaints were filed about their activities. Catania's own workers started getting better offers from competing organizations. The campaign ended when Catania was arrested on federal tax evasion charges based on evidence that had been anonymously given to Internal Revenue Service investigators. The evidence was complete and carefully organized, showing financial discrepancies that Catania could not explain without admitting to criminal activities. Catania was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, effectively ending his criminal career. His territories were taken over by Meyer's organization, but without the violence and publicity that usually came with such territorial changes. The removal of Catania established Meyer's reputation as a criminal strategist who could achieve traditional goals using non-traditional methods. More importantly, it showed the effectiveness of the information-based approach to criminal conflict that he would use throughout his career. But Meyer's greatest innovation during this period was not his strategic methods, but his realization that successful criminal organizations needed to operate like legal businesses in more than just their internal management structures. They also needed to build relationships with legal, political, and business leaders. This insight led Meyer to start what would become his most important and dangerous undertaking: the systematic bribery of American political institutions. Meyer's approach to political corruption was based on careful study of how legal businesses influenced government policy. Instead of relying on simple bribery or threats, he started building long-term relationships with politicians, judges, and government officials based on mutual benefit and shared interests. The key was understanding what political figures needed beyond money. Some wanted campaign contributions that could help them win elections. Others wanted business opportunities for their relatives or friends. Still others wanted information about their political opponents that could be used in campaigns or policy disputes. Meyer started providing all of these services through a network of intermediaries who could claim they didn't know where the help was really coming from. Campaign contributions were made through legal businesses that Meyer controlled. Business opportunities were created through companies that appeared to be independent, but were actually funded by criminal profits. Information about political opponents was gathered through private investigators who had no obvious connection to criminal organizations. This systematic approach to political corruption proved extremely effective. By 1928, Meyer had built relationships with dozens of judges, prosecutors, police officials, and elected representatives throughout the Northeast. These relationships gave him early warning about law enforcement activities, favorable treatment in legal proceedings, and influence over policy decisions that affected his operations. But the most significant relationship Meyer established during this period was with a rising political figure in New York named Jimmy Hines, a Tammany Hall district leader who controlled Democratic Party politics in several Manhattan neighborhoods. Hines was exactly the kind of politician Meyer had been looking for: intelligent, ambitious, and practical enough to understand that criminal organizations could be valuable political allies. In exchange for protection from law enforcement and favorable treatment in legal matters, Hines received substantial financial support for his political activities and detailed information about the activities of his political opponents. The relationship with Hines gave Meyer something that no other criminal leader had: direct influence over law enforcement policy in New York City. Through Hines, Meyer could make sure police raids were directed against his competitors rather than his own operations. He could influence the assignment of prosecutors to cases involving his workers. Most importantly, he could shape the overall approach that law enforcement agencies took toward organized crime. This political influence allowed Meyer to operate with unprecedented safety and profit. While other criminal groups lost significant parts of their earnings, subject to law enforcement interference. Meyer's operations were largely immune to official pressure. The period from 1925 to 1930 established Meyer Lansky as the most sophisticated criminal organizer in American history. His innovations in financial management, strategic planning, and political corruption would influence organized crime for generations. But perhaps his most important achievement was showing that criminal organizations could be more than just violent gangs. They could be sophisticated business enterprises that worked in partnership with legal institutions. This vision would be fully realized in the next phase of Meyer's career as he worked to create a truly national criminal organization that could work across state lines and coordinate activities between different ethnic groups and regional crime families. The foundation for this ambitious undertaking had been carefully laid during the late 1920s through alliances with key figures like Lucky Luciano, political relationships with figures like Jimmy Hines, and the development of organizational methods that could be scaled up to handle much larger and more complex operations. But making this vision real would require removing the old guard leaders who remained committed to traditional methods of criminal organization. The conflict that would make this possible was already beginning to develop as Meyer entered the 1930s, a decade that would see him reach the height of his power and influence. The decade of the 1930s opened with Meyer Lansky facing the greatest challenge of his criminal career, the approaching end of Prohibition, while other bootleggers focused on making as much short-term profit as possible from illegal alcohol. Meyer was developing a complete plan for moving his organization into new criminal activities that could provide long-term profit. His analysis of the situation was typically thorough. By 1930, public opinion had turned strongly against Prohibition, and political leaders from both parties were openly discussing ending it. Meyer calculated that the 21st Amendment would be approved by 1933 or 1934, ending the most profitable criminal enterprise in American history. But rather than seeing this as a crisis, Meyer saw it as a chance to remove competition and establish his organization as the dominant criminal enterprise in America. The logic was straightforward. Most bootlegging organizations had put all their resources into alcohol-related activities. When Prohibition ended, these groups would face immediate financial problems and would have to either break up or find new sources of money. The groups that survived would be those that had diversified their operations and built the political relationships necessary to run new types of criminal activities. Meyer had been preparing for this change since the mid-1920s. His organization had set up gambling operations in multiple cities, developed money laundering techniques that could handle profits from any criminal enterprise, and built political relationships that could provide protection for non-alcohol related activities. More importantly, he had formed alliances with criminal leaders who shared his vision of a post-Prohibition organized crime structure. The most important of these alliances was with Lucky Luciano, who had been working to modernize Italian-American crime families along lines similar to Meyer's approach. The opportunity to put their shared vision into action came in 1930 when a conflict erupted within New York's Italian-American crime families that became known as the Castellammarese War. The war pitted traditional crime bosses, led by Giuseppe Joe the Boss Mafia, against a newer generation led by Salvatore Maranzano, who had arrived from Sicily in the 1920s with ambitions to establish himself as the supreme leader of American organized crime. Both Mafia and Maranzano represented the old-style approach to criminal organization that Meyer and Lucky wanted to remove. Mafia was crude and violent, relying on threats rather than intelligence. Maranzano was more sophisticated, but was committed to traditional Sicilian methods that emphasized ethnic loyalty over business efficiency. Meyer and Lucky saw the Castellamarese war as a chance to remove both leaders and establish a new organizational structure for Italian-American organized crime. But their involvement had to be carefully managed to avoid creating suspicion about their ultimate goals. Meyer's role in the conflict was primarily financial and strategic. He provided loans to younger Italian-American criminals who were aligned with Lucky's group, giving them the resources needed to challenge the established leadership. He also used his political connections to make sure law enforcement pressure was directed against Masiria and Maranzano, rather than against their challengers. Most importantly, Meyer provided the strategic planning that enabled Lucky's group to outmaneuver opponents who had more people and more established territorial control. The Castellamarese War officially ended in April 1931 with the killing of Joe, the boss, Masiria, in a restaurant in Coney Island. Masiria was killed by gunmen who included Lucky Luciano, establishing Lucky as the dominant Italian-American crime leader in New York. But Salvatore Maranzano's attempt to establish himself as the supreme capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses, was quickly removed through a coordinated CAMPAIGN that showed the sophisticated planning capabilities Meyer and Lucky had developed. On September 10, 1931, Maranzano was killed in his Manhattan office by gunmen pretending to be federal agents. At the same time, dozens of old guard crime bosses throughout the United States were removed in what became known as the Night of the Sicilian Vespers. The coordinated nature of these killings showed that a new type of criminal organization had emerged, one that could plan and carry out complex operations across multiple cities with military precision. The removal of the old guard cleared the way for the establishment of what became known as the National Crime Syndicate, the most sophisticated criminal organization in American history. The syndicate was not a single hierarchical organization, but rather a partnership of independent groups that cooperated in areas of mutual benefit while keeping operational independence. Meyer's role in the syndicate was deliberately unclear. While Lucky Luciano was recognized as the most powerful Italian-American crime leader, Meyer was understood to be the financial and strategic architect of the new organization. This division of responsibilities reflected both men's understanding of their respective strengths and the political realities of organized crime in America. The syndicate's organizational structure reflected Meyer's vision of criminal enterprise as sophisticated business, rather than relying on ethnic loyalty or family relationships. The syndicate was organized around functional specialization and territorial efficiency. Different groups controlled different types of criminal activity: gambling, labor racketeering, narcotics, and cooperated when their interests aligned. Most importantly, the syndicate established formal ways to solve disputes without violence. A commission of senior leaders would hear complaints, investigate conflicts, and issue binding decisions that all member organizations were required to respect. This dispute resolution system dramatically reduced the amount of violence associated with organized crime, which in turn reduced law enforcement pressure and improved profitability for all member organizations. But Meyer's greatest innovation was the syndicate's approach to geographical expansion. Instead of trying to control territory through force, the syndicate set up partnerships with existing criminal groups in cities throughout the United States. The process typically began with Meyer, or one of his associates, visiting a city to check local conditions and find possible partners. They would analyze the local political structure, law enforcement capabilities, and economic opportunities, then approach established criminals with proposals for cooperation. The proposals were carefully designed to give immediate benefits to local groups, while establishing the syndicate's influence over long-term strategic decisions. Local groups would keep day-to-day control over their operations, but would coordinate pricing, territorial boundaries, and major policy decisions with syndicate leadership. This approach proved extremely effective. By 1935, the syndicate had set up operations or partnerships in more than 50 cities, creating the first truly national criminal organization in American history. The expansion was helped by Meyer's realization that successful criminal organization required more than just operational efficiency. It also required cultural acceptance. Americans needed to be convinced that organized crime was not a foreign conspiracy, but rather a natural result of American business culture. Meyer started building relationships with journalists, entertainment figures, and intellectual leaders who could influence public opinion about organized crime. He provided financial support for movies, books, and magazine articles that showed criminals as entrepreneurs rather than thugs, as patriots rather than foreigners, as products of American capitalism rather than foreign corruption. This cultural campaign was remarkably successful. By the mid-1930s, American popular culture had started to romanticize organized crime figures as anti-establishment, heroes who represented traditional American values, like individualism and entrepreneurship. But Meyer's most ambitious undertaking during this period was his expansion into legal business. Instead of simply using legal businesses as covers for criminal activities, Meyer started developing legal enterprises that could make substantial profits on their own, independent of any criminal connection. The strategy was based on his realization that the most successful criminal organizations would be those that could work in both legal and illegal markets, using their advantages in one area to strengthen their position in the other. Criminal organizations had several advantages over legal businesses. They could remove competition through threats. They could bribe government officials who might otherwise regulate their activities. And they had access to money that was not subject to banking rules or tax obligations. Meyer started using these advantages in legal businesses, beginning with restaurants and nightclubs in New York and expanding to include construction companies, labor unions, and eventually casinos in Nevada and Cuba. The casino operations were especially important because they combined legal business with criminal opportunity. Casinos were legal businesses that made substantial legal profits, but they also offered chances for money laundering, tax evasion, and various forms of fraud. Meyer's first major casino investment was in Las Vegas, Nevada, where gambling had been made legal in 1931. He realized that Las Vegas had the potential to become a major tourist destination, but only if casino operations were professionally managed and free from the crude, criminal behavior that marked illegal gambling in other cities. Working with his longtime partner, Bugsy Siegel, Meyer started developing casino operations that combined criminal sophistication with legal business practices. Their casinos employed professional managers, kept detailed financial records, and provided high-quality entertainment that attracted customers who would never have visited illegal gambling operations. But the Las Vegas operations also included sophisticated techniques for taking extra profits through methods that were not entirely legal. Casino employees took cash from gambling earnings before they were recorded in official books, reducing tax obligations and providing untraceable money that could be used for other criminal activities. The combination of legal profits and illegal schemes made the Las Vegas operations extremely profitable, providing Meyer with the money needed to expand his criminal empire and establish himself as one of the wealthiest individuals in America. By 1940, Meyer Lansky controlled criminal operations that spanned the continent and made an estimated $50 million annually, equal to about $1 billion today. His organization employed thousands of people, kept relationships with political leaders at every level of government, and ran legal businesses that provided goods and services to millions of Americans. But Meyer understood that his success had made him a target for law enforcement agencies that were starting to develop more sophisticated approaches to investigating organized crime. The challenge of the 1940s would be keeping his criminal empire while avoiding the legal consequences that had destroyed many other criminal leaders. The solution would require all of Meyer's skills as a strategist, politician, and businessman. But it would also require making moral compromises that would test his character in ways that simple criminal enterprise had never demanded. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, created an extraordinary paradox for Meyer Lansky. As Japanese bombs destroyed American naval vessels and killed American servicemen, Meyer faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could continue operating as a criminal who happened to be American, or he could become an American who happened to be a criminal. The difference might seem small, but for Meyer it was fundamental. Despite his criminal activities, Meyer had always considered himself a patriot. His parents had fled European persecution to find freedom in America, and Meyer had built his fortune using opportunities that existed nowhere else in the world. When America was threatened, Meyer's response was immediate and clear. He would use his criminal organization to defend his country. The opportunity to show this commitment came through an unexpected source: the United States Navy. In early 1942, German submarines began sinking ships off the American coast with devastating effectiveness. During the first 6 months of the war, German submarines destroyed more than 300 vessels in American coastal waters, including merchant ships carrying vital supplies to Allied forces in Europe. Naval intelligence quickly discovered that the submarines were getting help from sources on land: spies who provided information about ship movements, saboteurs who damaged port facilities, and informants who reported on American defensive preparations. The problem was especially serious in New York Harbor, the most important port on the East Coast and the departure point for many convoys carrying supplies to Britain and the Soviet Union. Navy investigators suspected that German agents had gotten into the waterfront workforce, but they lacked the information networks needed to identify specific threats. This was where Meyer Lansky's criminal organization became invaluable to American national security. The New York waterfront was controlled by Italian-American crime families that had been part of Meyer's syndicate since the early 1930s. These organizations employed thousands of longshoremen, controlled the major shipping unions, and kept extensive information networks throughout the port area. More importantly, the waterfront crime families had no sympathy for Nazi Germany. Many of their members were Italian Americans whose relatives in Italy were suffering under Mussolini's fascist regime. Others were Jewish Americans whose families had fled European persecution. All of them understood that a German victory would threaten the political freedoms and economic opportunities that had enabled their success in America. The first contact between naval intelligence and Meyer's organization was set up by Murray Gurfein, a federal prosecutor who had been investigating organized crime before the war, but who now worked for the Office of Strategic Services, a predecessor to the CIA. Gurfein understood that regular law enforcement methods would not be enough for the security challenges the war had created. The Navy needed information about waterfront activities, but they needed it quickly and from sources that German agents would not suspect. The meeting between Gurfein and Meyer took place in a lawyer's office in downtown Manhattan in March 1942. Also present was Joseph Sachs Lanza, a crime family leader who controlled the Fulton Fish Market and much of the waterfront activity in Lower Manhattan. Gerfin's proposal was straightforward. The Navy needed Meyer's organization to watch waterfront activities, identify suspicious people, and report any evidence of sabotage or spying. In exchange, the government would stop prosecuting organized crime figures who helped the war effort and would provide post-war protection for those who assisted American intelligence activities. Meyer's response was immediate. His organization would provide complete cooperation with American intelligence efforts, and they would do so without any conditions or guarantees about post-war treatment. "This is our country," Meyer told Gerfin. "We'll do whatever is necessary to protect it." The cooperation between Meyer's criminal organization and American naval intelligence became known as Operation Underworld, one of the most successful intelligence operations in American history. Within weeks of the initial agreement, Meyer had organized a complete information network that covered every major port facility from Boston to Baltimore. Hundreds of longshoremen, truck drivers, warehouse workers, and ship repair specialists started reporting suspicious activities to designated contacts, who passed information to naval intelligence. The information network was extremely effective because it was based on relationships and loyalties that had been developed over decades. Workers who might have been suspicious of government agents trusted crime family leaders who had provided them with jobs, protection, and financial help. More importantly, the criminal organization's information network was far more sophisticated than anything the Navy could have developed on its own. Meyer's workers had been gathering information about port activities for years as part of their legal and illegal business operations. They knew which workers had money problems that might make them open to bribery, which shipping companies had questionable business practices, and which areas of the waterfront were most vulnerable to sabotage. The results of Operation Underworld exceeded everyone's expectations. German attempts to get into the waterfront were found and stopped before they could cause significant damage. Suspected saboteurs were identified and arrested based on information from Meyer's network. Most importantly, the level of security on the waterfront improved dramatically, reducing successful German submarine attacks and protecting vital supply lines to Allied forces. But Meyer's help to the American war effort went far beyond waterfront security. His criminal organization also provided information about Axis activities in other areas and helped with various secret operations that required capabilities that regular government agencies lacked. One of the most significant operations involved Sicily, where Allied forces were planning an invasion as part of their campaign to remove Italy from the war. American military leaders needed detailed information about Sicilian geography, German defensive positions, and the attitudes of local people toward Allied forces. Meyer's organization had extensive connections with Sicilian crime families through relationships that had been set up during the 1920s and 1930s. Many Sicilian crime leaders had relatives in America who were part of Meyer's syndicate, and they shared a common interest in removing the fascist regime that had suppressed their activities. Through these connections, Meyer was able to give American military planners detailed maps of Sicilian coastlines, information about German troop concentrations, and assurances that local people would cooperate with Allied forces. When the Allied invasion of Sicily began in July 1943, American troops faced much less resistance than they had expected, partly because Sicilian crime families had given them advanced information about German defensive positions and had encouraged local people to help. The success of these intelligence operations established Meyer as one of the most valuable civilian helpers to the American war effort. But his wartime activities also created moral complexities that would affect his post-war career in ways that he did not initially expect. By cooperating with American intelligence agencies, Meyer had shown that criminal organizations could serve legitimate national interests. But he had also built relationships with government officials that could be used to protect his criminal activities after the war ended. The moral complexity of Meyer's wartime role was further complicated by his business activities during the war period. While he was providing intelligence to help defeat Nazi Germany, he was also growing his criminal operations to take advantage of wartime economic conditions. The war created huge opportunities for black market activities. Rationing of consumer goods created demand for illegal products. Price controls created chances for black market sales. And the focus of law enforcement on national security reduced attention to traditional criminal activities. Meyer's organization became deeply involved in black market operations, especially the illegal sale of rationed goods like meat, sugar, gasoline, and automobile tires. These activities were very profitable, but also contributed to inflation and reduced the availability of essential goods for ordinary Americans. Meyer justified these activities by arguing that black market operations actually helped the war effort by making sure goods reached consumers who needed them most and were willing to pay premium prices. But critics argued that black market activities weakened government economic policies and contributed to social inequality. During a time when national unity was essential, the moral complexity of Meyer's wartime activities was perhaps best shown by his relationship with his longtime partner Bugsy Siegel. While Meyer was cooperating with American intelligence agencies on the East Coast, Bugsy was developing casino operations in Las Vegas that provided entertainment for defense workers and military personnel. The Las Vegas operations were technically legal, but they also offered chances for money laundering, tax evasion, and various forms of fraud. More problematically, Bugsy was using profits from Las Vegas operations to finance other activities that had no connection to the war effort and that sometimes conflicted with American interests. By 1944, Meyer had become concerned that Bugsy's activities were creating unnecessary risks for their organization and possibly harming their relationships with government officials. But Bugsy had been his closest friend and most trusted partner for more than 25 years, and Meyer was reluctant to take action that might damage their relationship. The tension between personal loyalty and business necessity would come to a head in the post-war period, when Meyer would be forced to make the most difficult decision of his criminal career. But during the war itself, Meyer's primary focus remained on helping American victory over fascism. His criminal organization continued to provide intelligence to government agencies, and Meyer personally gave substantial amounts to war bond drives and other patriotic activities. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Meyer had legitimate reason to feel proud of his help to American victory. His information network had protected American port facilities from sabotage. His Sicilian connections had helped the Allied invasion of Italy, and his organization had shown that even criminal enterprises could serve legitimate national interests when circumstances required it. But Meyer also understood that the end of the war would bring new challenges. Government officials who had worked with his organization during the war might not be willing to continue those relationships during peacetime. Law enforcement agencies that had focused on national security during the war would refocus on traditional criminal activities. Most importantly, the moral authority that Meyer had gained through his wartime service would be tested by the criminal activities he would pursue in the post-war period. The 5 years from 1940 to 1945 had established Meyer Lansky as one of the most powerful and complex figures in American society. He was simultaneously a successful criminal and a patriotic American, a sophisticated businessman and a provider of illegal services, a defender of American democracy, and a corrupter of American institutions. These contradictions would become even more pronounced in the post-war period, as Meyer attempted to build on his wartime relationships while expanding his criminal empire into new areas of activity. The end of World War II in 1945 presented Meyer Lansky with both unprecedented opportunities and extraordinary dangers. His organization had emerged from the war stronger and more sophisticated than ever before, with political connections that reached into the highest levels of government and financial resources that exceeded those of many legal corporations. Meyer also faced new challenges that would test every aspect of his strategic thinking and moral character. The most immediate challenge involved his oldest friend and most trusted partner, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. During the war years, while Meyer had been focused on intelligence operations and East Coast criminal activities, Bugsy had been developing casino operations in Las Vegas, Nevada. The Las Vegas project had initially seemed like a natural extension of their gambling operations, taking advantage of Nevada's liberal gaming laws to create legal casino businesses that could also serve as money laundering operations for their criminal activities. But by 1945, the Las Vegas project had become something much more ambitious and much more dangerous than Meyer had originally imagined. Bugsy's vision for Las Vegas was grand. He wanted to create a gambling and entertainment destination that would rival Monte Carlo or Havana, attracting wealthy customers from across the United States and around the world. The centerpiece of this vision was the Flamingo Hotel, a fancy casino resort that would set new standards for elegance and sophistication in American gambling. The problem was that Bugsy's vision required huge amounts of money, far more than their criminal organization could provide without weakening other operations. To pay for the Flamingo, Bugsy had borrowed money from crime families throughout the United States, promising returns that depended on the casino's success. By early 1946, construction costs for the Flamingo had gone over $6 million, equal to more than $80 million today, and the project was still not finished. Worse, Bugsy's management of the construction had been chaotic and wasteful, with cost overruns that suggested either incompetence or stealing. Meyer traveled to Las Vegas in March 1946 to see the situation for himself. What he found worried him both as a businessman and as a friend. The Flamingo construction site was a mess of unfinished buildings, cost overruns, and construction delays that seemed to have no end. More troubling was Bugsy's behavior. The charming, energetic partner Meyer had known for nearly 30 years had become obsessed with the Flamingo project, spending 16-hour days at the construction site, making impulsive decisions that increased costs, and alienating the contractors and workers whose cooperation was essential for the project's success. Meyer suspected that Bugsy was using drugs, possibly the amphetamines that had become popular among entertainment figures and high-pressure businessmen during the war. But when he talked to Bugsy about his concerns, his old friend dismissed them with an angry outburst and showed how much the relationship had deteriorated. "You don't understand what we're building here," Bugsy told him. "This isn't just another casino. This is going to be the most beautiful, most profitable resort in the world. When it's finished, we'll be making more money than we ever dreamed of." Meyer's response was typically analytical. He had reviewed the Flamingo's financial projections, and even under the most optimistic scenarios, the casino could not make enough profit to justify the huge investment that Bugsy was making. "The numbers don't work, Ben," Meyer said, using the childhood nickname that only he was allowed to use. "Even if everything goes perfectly, it'll take 15 years to get our money back. And if anything goes wrong, if the economy turns down, if gambling laws change, if we have serious competition, we could lose everything." Bugsy's reaction to this analysis was explosive. He accused Meyer of lacking vision, of being too cautious to see a historic opportunity, of betraying their partnership by questioning his judgment. The argument that followed was the most serious conflict in their 30-year relationship, but more importantly, it revealed that Bugsy had made commitments that went far beyond what Meyer had authorized, and that could not be undone without devastating consequences for their entire organization. Bugsy had borrowed money from crime families in New York, Chicago, Cleveland, and Detroit using the Flamingo Project as collateral. If the casino failed, these groups would demand repayment from Meyer's operations, potentially bankrupting the entire syndicate. Worse, Bugsy had made personal promises to several crime leaders, telling them that the Flamingo would make specific amounts of profit within specific time frames. If these promises were not kept, Bugsy, and by extension Meyer, would face revenge from some of the most dangerous criminals in America. Meyer realized that he faced an impossible choice. He could continue supporting Bugsy's vision, risking the financial stability of his entire organization, or he could withdraw his support, effectively ending his partnership with his oldest friend and possibly sending Bugsy to violent revenge from other crime families. The decision was complicated by Meyer's true affection for Bugsy and his recognition that their partnership had been the foundation of his criminal success. Without Bugsy's courage and charm, Meyer might never have risen above the level of a neighborhood loan shark and numbers runner. But Meyer also understood that successful criminal organizations required discipline and rational decision-making. Personal relationships could not be allowed to override business necessities, especially when the survival of the entire organization was at stake. The Flamingo Hotel opened on December 26, 1946, with a celebrity-filled party that got national media attention. The casino was indeed beautiful, with fancy rooms, top entertainment, and gaming facilities that set new standards for elegance and sophistication. But the opening was also a financial disaster. The casino lost more than $300,000 during its first few weeks of operation, partly due to operational problems, but also because several high-stakes gamblers won large amounts using methods that suggested the games were being cheated. Meyer's investigation revealed that the Flamingo was indeed being systematically cheated, but not by customers. Instead, casino employees were taking money from gaming earnings, stealing cash from registers, and selling casino chips to outside parties who could trade them in for full value. The theft was happening on such a large scale that it threatened the casino's survival, regardless of its other operational problems. But when Meyer showed evidence of the theft to Bugsy, his partner's response was to blame the losses on bad luck and temporary operational difficulties. It was at this point that Meyer realized Bugsy was no longer capable of making rational business decisions. Whether due to drug use, psychological pressure, or simple obsession with his Las Vegas vision, Bugsy had become a risk to their organization rather than an asset. The final crisis came in early 1947 when representatives from several crime families arrived in Las Vegas to demand explanations for the Flamingo's continued losses. These men had put substantial money into the project based on Bugsy's promises, and they were not willing to accept excuses for the casino's poor performance. The meeting took place in Bugsy's suite at the Flamingo, with Meyer serving as a mediator between his partner and the increasingly angry investors. The discussion quickly showed that Bugsy had no realistic plan for making the casino profitable and no believable explanation for the continued losses. More damaging was the discovery that Bugsy had been secretly moving money from Flamingo accounts to personal bank accounts in Switzerland, apparently planning to flee the United States if the casino project collapsed entirely. This discovery ended any possibility of a negotiated solution. The crime family representatives made it clear that they saw Bugsy's actions as theft and betrayal, crimes that carried a death sentence under the informal rules that governed organized crime. Meyer made one final attempt to save his friend's life by suggesting that Bugsy be allowed to pay back the stolen money and resign from all involvement in Las Vegas operations. But the suggestion was rejected by the other crime leaders, who argued that allowing such betrayal to go unpunished would encourage similar behavior by other workers. On June 20th, 1947, Benjamin Siegel was shot and killed while sitting in the living room of his girlfriend's house in Beverly Hills. The killing was carried out with military precision by unknown gunmen who escaped without leaving any evidence that could be traced back to the crime families who had ordered his death. Meyer Lansky's role in Bugsy Siegel's death remains one of the most controversial aspects of his criminal career. Meyer never publicly admitted to taking part in the decision to kill his oldest friend, and no direct evidence was ever found linking him to the killing. But several factors suggest that Meyer at minimum agreed to the decision to remove Bugsy. He had been at the meeting where Bugsy's fate was discussed. He had failed to warn Bugsy about the threats against his life, and he moved quickly after the killing to take control of Flamingo operations. More tellingly, Meyer's behavior after Bugsy's death suggested that he had been preparing for this outcome for some time. Within hours of the killing, Meyer's workers had taken control of the Flamingo's management, put in place new security procedures to prevent theft, and begun talks to change the casino's debt obligations. The speed and efficiency of these actions suggested careful advance planning that would have been impossible if Bugsy's death had been unexpected. Meyer's decision to take part in, or at least allow, Bugsy Siegel's death marked a turning point in his moral development. For the first time in his criminal career, he had allowed business considerations to override personal loyalty, sacrificing his oldest friend to protect his larger organization. The decision haunted Meyer for the rest of his life, but it also showed his growth into a criminal leader who could make the hard choices that organizational survival sometimes required. The sentimental young man who had formed the Bugs and Meyer Mob in 1920 had become a calculating executive who understood that even the closest personal relationships were secondary to business necessities. But the removal of Bugsy Siegel also cleared the way for Meyer to put his own vision for Las Vegas development into action. Instead of pursuing Bugsy's grand dreams of creating an American Monte Carlo, Meyer focused on building a sustainable casino industry that could make steady profits while avoiding the regulatory attention that too much ambition might attract. Under Meyer's management, the Flamingo became consistently profitable within 18 months of Bugsy's death. The casino's success attracted other investors to Las Vegas, leading to a construction boom that would eventually change the desert city into one of America's top tourist destinations. But Meyer's involvement in Las Vegas also set patterns of casino operation that would affect American gambling for decades. The skimming operations that Meyer developed, systematically removing cash from casino earnings before they were recorded for tax purposes, became standard practice throughout Nevada's gambling industry. These operations allowed casino owners to avoid taxes, hide profits from government regulators, and provide untraceable cash that could be used for other criminal activities. But they also created opportunities for corruption and fraud that would eventually attract intense law enforcement attention. By 1950, Meyer Lansky controlled casino operations that made more than $10 million annually in total earnings and employed thousands of people. His Las Vegas investments had made him one of the wealthiest individuals in America, with assets that included legal businesses, real estate, and financial instruments that could support a luxurious lifestyle. But Meyer's success in Las Vegas had also made him a target for law enforcement agencies that were starting to understand the sophisticated nature of modern organized crime. The challenge of the 1950s would be keeping his criminal empire while avoiding the legal consequences that his visibility and success had made increasingly unavoidable. The Las Vegas period established Meyer Lansky as the most successful criminal entrepreneur in American history. But it also showed the moral costs of criminal success and the personal sacrifices that keeping criminal power ultimately required. The vision that Meyer and Bugsy had shared as teenagers, building a criminal organization that could operate like a legal business, had been largely achieved. But achieving it had required choices that neither of them had anticipated when their partnership began 30 years earlier. The decade of the 1950s opened with Meyer Lansky at the height of his power and influence. His criminal organization controlled operations in dozens of cities, made annual earnings that exceeded those of most Fortune 500 companies, and kept political relationships that provided protection from law enforcement at every level of government. But Meyer had also become the most visible symbol of organized crime in America, attracting attention from journalists, politicians, and law enforcement officials who were starting to understand the sophisticated nature of modern criminal enterprise. The first major threat to Meyer's empire came from an unexpected source: television. In May 1950, Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee announced the formation of a special Senate committee to investigate organized crime in interstate commerce. The Kefauver Committee, as it became known, was authorized to hold public hearings that would be broadcast on television, bringing the realities of organized crime into American living rooms for the first time. Meyer initially dismissed the Kefauver Committee as a publicity stunt designed to help the senator's political career. He had dealt with congressional investigations before, and his experience suggested that politicians were more interested in making headlines than in doing serious investigations. But Meyer underestimated both Senator Kefauver's determination and the power of television to influence public opinion. The Kefauver Committee hearings became a national sensation, attracting audiences that rivaled the most popular entertainment programs and creating the first complete public exposure of organized crime activities. The committee's investigation was more thorough than any previous law enforcement effort directed at organized crime. Kefauver's staff included former FBI agents, experienced prosecutors, and financial analysts who understood the sophisticated methods that modern criminal organizations used to hide their activities. Most importantly, the committee had the power to force testimony from witnesses who had previously been able to avoid law enforcement attention by claiming Fifth Amendment protections or simply refusing to cooperate. Meyer was called to testify before the committee in March 1951, appearing at a hearing that was watched by an estimated 30 million Americans. The hearing gave the American public their first chance to see and hear the man who had been described by law enforcement officials as the most important criminal in America. The contrast between public expectations and reality was striking. Instead of the crude gangster that popular culture had prepared viewers to expect, Meyer appeared as a quiet, well-dressed businessman who spoke softly and chose his words carefully. When asked about his criminal activities, Meyer consistently used his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, refusing to answer questions about his business activities, his workers, or his sources of income. "I refuse to answer on the grounds that it might tend to incriminate me," became Meyer's standard response to almost every real question from committee members. Meyer's testimony was frustrating for committee members who had hoped to get dramatic admissions of criminal activity. But it was also revealing in ways that Meyer did not expect. His obvious intelligence, his careful attention to legal details, and his sophisticated understanding of constitutional protections went against popular stereotypes about organized crime figures. More importantly, Meyer's refusal to answer questions created an impression of guilt that was perhaps more damaging than any specific admissions might have been. Television viewers who watched Meyer use the Fifth Amendment dozens of times concluded that he was obviously guilty of the crimes that committee members were investigating. The Kefauver committee hearings had several immediate consequences for Meyer's organization. Public awareness of organized crime increased dramatically, creating political pressure for more aggressive law enforcement efforts. Several of Meyer's political allies moved away from him to avoid being connected with criminal activities that had received such extensive publicity. Most seriously, the hearings gave law enforcement agencies detailed information about organized crime operations that they could use for future investigations. The committee staff had developed extensive files on criminal organizations throughout the United States, creating a roadmap that prosecutors could follow in building criminal cases. But the most significant long-term result of the Kefauver Committee was its effect on Meyer's personal psychology. For the first time in his criminal career, he had been forced to appear publicly as a defendant rather than as a powerful behind-the-scenes operator. The experience was humiliating and disturbing for someone who had spent 30 years building an image as a neighing, invisible power broker who could influence events without being held responsible for their results. Meyer's response to the Kefauver Committee was typically methodical. He started developing strategies for working in an environment of increased law enforcement attention, while also working to fix the political relationships that the hearings had damaged. The first priority was reducing his public visibility. Meyer began giving operational control of his criminal activities to subordinates, while keeping strategic oversight through a network of trusted intermediaries. He also started spending more time outside the United States, especially in Cuba, where he could conduct business activities that were beyond the reach of American law enforcement. Cuba had been an important part of Meyer's operations since the 1930s, when he had built relationships with Cuban political leaders who were willing to allow casino operations in exchange for substantial financial payments. The most important of these relationships was with Colonel Fulgencio Batista, who had controlled Cuban politics either directly or indirectly since 1933. Batista understood that casino operations could provide significant money for the Cuban government, while also creating jobs for Cuban workers. Under an agreement negotiated by Meyer, American crime syndicates would be allowed to operate casinos in Havana in exchange for payments to the Cuban government and guarantees that casino operations would be conducted professionally without the violence or corruption that marked illegal gambling operations in the United States. The Cuban casino operations were extremely profitable, making more money than the Las Vegas operations and providing Meyer with a source of income that was largely beyond the reach of American law enforcement. But the Cuban operations also created new weaknesses. Meyer's success in Havana attracted attention from American journalists and law enforcement officials who were investigating his activities. More importantly, his alliance with the Batista regime connected his criminal organization with a Cuban government that was increasingly unpopular with the Cuban people. By the mid-1950s, revolutionary movements led by Fidel Castro and other opponents of the Batista regime were gaining strength throughout Cuba. Meyer initially dismissed these movements as minor threats that could be contained through the same combination of bribery and threats that had worked in the United States. But Meyer underestimated both the strength of Cuban revolutionary feeling, and the determination of revolutionary leaders who could not be bought or scared. The Cuban Revolution began in earnest in 1956 when Castro landed in eastern Cuba with a small force of guerrilla fighters. Over the next 3 years, Castro's revolutionary army gradually gained control of Cuban territory, finally forcing Batista to flee the country on January 1, 1959. The success of the Cuban Revolution was a financial disaster for Meyer's organization. Castro's government immediately took all casino operations, taking assets worth an estimated $100 million and removing one of Meyer's most important sources of money. But the Cuban Revolution also created political problems for Meyer that were even more serious than the immediate financial losses. Castro's government started giving out details about American organized crime operations in Cuba, providing information that could be used by American law enforcement agencies to build criminal cases against Meyer and his workers. More importantly, the Cuban Revolution showed that Meyer's empire was open to political changes that he could not control or predict. Despite his wealth, his political connections, and his reputation for strategic planning, he had been unable to prevent the loss of operations that had taken decades to build. The Cuban crisis happened at the same time as increased law enforcement pressure in the United States. The success of the Kefauver Committee had encouraged other politicians to start their own investigations of organized crime, creating a series of congressional hearings and grand jury proceedings that kept Meyer and his workers under constant legal attention. The most serious of these investigations was led by Robert F. Kennedy, who served as chief counsel for the Senate Rackets Committee and later as Attorney General under his brother President John F. Kennedy. Robert Kennedy's approach to investigating organized crime was more systematic and more aggressive than any previous law enforcement effort. Kennedy understood that successful prosecutions would require patient development of evidence over long periods, rather than the dramatic confrontations that had marked earlier investigations. Kennedy's staff included experienced prosecutors, skilled investigators, and financial analysts who could trace the complex money laundering operations that Meyer had developed to hide his criminal profits. Most importantly, Kennedy had the political support needed to keep investigations going long-term despite the corruption and threats that had previously protected organized crime figures. The Kennedy investigations focused particular attention on Meyer's financial activities, recognizing that successful criminal prosecutions would require proving that his wealthy lifestyle was supported by illegal income that had not been reported for tax purposes. This approach proved more effective than previous law enforcement efforts. While Meyer had been able to avoid criminal convictions for violent crimes or specific criminal acts, his financial activities created a paper trail that could be followed by skilled investigators. In 1962, Meyer was charged with federal tax evasion based on evidence that he had failed to report substantial income from illegal gambling operations. The charges carried possible penalties of up to 10 years in federal prison and hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines and back taxes. The tax evasion case represented the most serious legal threat that Meyer had ever faced. Unlike previous investigations that had focused on his criminal activities generally, the tax charges were based on specific financial evidence that could be confirmed through bank records, real estate transactions, and other documentary proof. Meyer's response to the tax evasion charges showed both his legal sophistication and his understanding of American political realities. Instead of trying to fight the charges through traditional legal defenses, he started exploring the possibility of leaving the United States entirely. The strategy was based on Meyer's calculation that American law enforcement agencies would eventually succeed in convicting him of some criminal charges regardless of his actual guilt or innocence. The resources being spent to investigate his activities were too large, and the political pressure for successful prosecutions was too strong for him to avoid all legal consequences forever. But Meyer also understood that leaving the United States would require finding another country that would accept him and provide protection from American extradition efforts. The country would need to have no extradition treaty with the United States, or would need to be willing to ignore such treaties for political or financial reasons. Meyer's first choice was Israel, a country that had been established in 1948 as a homeland for Jewish people who had suffered persecution around the world. Meyer believed that his Jewish heritage, combined with his financial resources and his history of supporting Jewish causes, would make him welcome in Israel. The decision to seek refuge in Israel also reflected Meyer's complex relationship with his Jewish identity throughout his criminal career. He had kept connections with Jewish organizations, supported Jewish charities, and employed Jewish workers in key positions within his organization. But Meyer's relationship with Judaism was complicated by his criminal activities. Traditional Jewish law and ethics condemned the kinds of activities that had made Meyer wealthy and powerful, creating moral conflicts that he had never fully resolved. The attempt to find refuge in Israel would ultimately fail, but it would also force Meyer to face basic questions about his identity, his values, and his legacy that he had been able to avoid throughout his criminal career. By 1970, Meyer Lansky was 68 years old and facing the most serious crisis of his criminal career. The tax evasion charges that had been filed against him in 1962 remained unresolved, creating legal uncertainties that made it impossible for him to run his criminal organization effectively. More importantly, the law enforcement pressure that had begun with the Kefauver Committee 20 years earlier was getting stronger rather than weaker. Meyer's response to this crisis was typically calculated. If he could not safely stay in the United States, he would set up residence in another country that could provide protection from American prosecutors. But if he was going to leave America, he wanted to do so on his own terms, in a way that would give both personal safety and the possibility of returning if political conditions changed. The country that Meyer chose for his exile was Israel, the Jewish state that had been established in 1948. Meyer's decision was based on several factors. Israel's law of return gave automatic citizenship to any Jewish person who chose to move there. Israel had no extradition treaty with the United States, and Meyer believed that his financial resources and political connections could help him establish a new life there. Meyer's decision to seek refuge in Israel also reflected deeper psychological and emotional factors. Throughout his criminal career, he had kept a strong connection to Jewish culture and Jewish causes, even as his activities broke basic rules of Jewish law and ethics. Meyer had regularly given money to Jewish charities, supported the establishment of Israel, and employed Jewish workers in key positions within his organization. But he had also built his fortune through activities like gambling, loan sharking, and corruption that traditional Jewish authorities considered morally wrong. The conflict between Meyer's Jewish identity and his criminal activities had never been fully solved, creating inner tensions that would become more obvious as he aged and started thinking about his final legacy. In June 1970, Meyer flew from Miami to Tel Aviv, carrying an Israeli passport that had been obtained through his application for citizenship under the law of return. His arrival in Israel was carefully planned to avoid attention, but news of his presence quickly reached Israeli and American media. The reaction in both countries was immediate and intense. American law enforcement officials demanded that Israel send Meyer back to face trial on tax evasion charges. while Israeli officials found themselves caught between their country's commitment to providing refuge for Jewish immigrants and international pressure to cooperate with American criminal investigations. Meyer's presence in Israel also created controversy within Israeli society. Some Israelis welcomed him as a successful Jewish American businessman who could contribute to the country's economic development. Others saw him as a criminal whose presence would damage Israel's international reputation and moral standing. The debate over Meyer's status in Israel continued for more than 2 years, with legal proceedings that examined both his right to Israeli citizenship and the validity of American extradition requests. Meyer hired the best lawyers available and used his financial resources to build political support for his case. But Meyer also discovered that the skills that had made him successful in America were not necessarily useful in Israeli society. The political corruption that had protected him in the United States was less common in Israel, and the cultural values that dominated Israeli society were different from those he had encountered in the American criminal underworld. More importantly, Meyer found himself psychologically unprepared for life as a refugee. Throughout his criminal career, he had been a powerful behind-the-scenes operator who could influence events through wealth and connections. In Israel, he was a controversial immigrant whose presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. The isolation and uncertainty of his Israeli exile took a significant psychological toll on Meyer. He had left behind not just his criminal operations, but also his family, his friends, and the cultural environment that had shaped his identity for 70 years. In November 1972, the Israeli Supreme Court ruled that Meyer's citizenship application was invalid and that he could be sent back to the United States to face criminal charges. The court's decision was based on findings that Meyer had gotten his Israeli passport through misrepresentation and that his criminal activities made him unsuitable for Israeli citizenship. Meyer's reaction to the Israeli court decision was a mix of anger, disappointment, and acceptance. He had put substantial time and money into establishing his Israeli residence, and the rejection was both a personal and strategic defeat. But Meyer also understood that the Israeli court decision was probably unavoidable. The international pressure on Israel to cooperate with American law enforcement had been too strong, and Meyer's criminal reputation had made it impossible for Israeli officials to give him the protection he had sought. In December 1972, Meyer returned to the United States, where he was immediately arrested by federal agents and charged with tax evasion, conspiracy, and various other criminal violations. The charges were based on evidence that had been developed during his absence and could result in decades in prison if he was convicted. But Meyer's legal situation was more complex than law enforcement officials initially realized. During his 2 years in Israel, American prosecutors had encountered significant problems in building their case against him. Many of the witnesses they needed had died, disappeared, or become unwilling to testify. Financial records that were crucial to proving tax evasion charges had been destroyed or had become legally unavailable. More importantly, Meyer's advanced age and health problems made him a less attractive target for prosecution than he had been a decade earlier. At age 70, he was no longer the powerful criminal leader who had controlled operations throughout the United States. Instead, he was an elderly man whose criminal organization had been significantly weakened by his long absence and by the law enforcement pressure that had been applied during the 1960s and early 1970s. The federal prosecutors who handled Meyer's case faced a difficult choice. They could go forward with criminal charges that might result in conviction, but would probably not result in significant prison time given Meyer's age and health. Or they could negotiate a plea agreement that would resolve the case without the risks and expenses of a long trial. After months of negotiation, Meyer agreed to plead guilty to a single misdemeanor tax violation in exchange for dismissal of all other charges. He was sentenced to 1 year in federal prison, a term that was suspended because of his age and health conditions, and ordered to pay substantial fines and back taxes. The resolution of Meyer's legal problems allowed him to return to Miami Beach, where he had kept a residence since the 1940s. But the Miami Beach that welcomed him back was very different from the city he had left 3 years earlier. Meyer's long absence had allowed other criminal groups to expand their operations in South Florida, reducing his influence and removing many of the business relationships that had been sources of his wealth and power. More importantly, the law enforcement attention that had driven him into exile continued to make it difficult for him to start again in criminal activities. At age 71, Meyer Lansky found himself in an unusual position for someone with his criminal background. He was basically retired from active criminal enterprise, living on investments and savings that had been built up during his decades of illegal activity. The final decade of Meyer's life was marked by increasing isolation and declining health. He suffered from heart disease that limited his physical activities, and he experienced depression and anxiety that may have been related to his loss of power and influence. But Meyer's retirement also gave him chances for reflection and thinking that had not been available during his active criminal career. For the first time in decades, he was not focused on operational problems, legal threats, or strategic planning during this period. Meyer started building relationships with journalists and authors who were interested in writing about his life and career. These relationships allowed him to present his own version of events that had been twisted or misunderstood in previous accounts of organized crime history. Meyer's conversations with journalists showed both his intelligence and his moral complexity. He was clearly proud of his organizational achievements and his financial success, but he also expressed regret about some of the decisions he had made and some of the people he had hurt. Most notably, Meyer continued to be troubled by his role in the killing of Bugsy Siegel, his oldest friend and longest business partner. While he never publicly admitted to taking part in the decision to kill Bugsy, his private comments suggested that the decision remained a source of guilt and sorrow. Meyer's thoughts about his criminal career also showed his continuing belief that his activities had been basically legitimate, even if they had been technically illegal. He argued that his gambling operations had provided entertainment that people wanted, that his financial services had helped people who could not get credit through legal sources, and that his political corruption had simply recognized the realities of how American politics actually worked. But Meyer also acknowledged that his criminal activities had created problems for society and had damaged institutions that were essential to democratic government. He seemed genuinely unsure about whether his life's work had been ultimately helpful or harmful to the country that had given him opportunities for success. On January 15th, 1983, Meyer Lansky died of heart failure at Mount Sinai Medical Center in Miami Beach. He was 80 years old and had lived longer than almost any other major organized crime figure of his generation. Meyer's death got relatively little media attention, reflecting both his advanced age and his reduced influence during his final years. The obituaries that were published generally described him as an important historical figure whose criminal activities had helped shape American organized crime during the 20th century. But Meyer's death also marked the end of an era in American criminal history. He had been the last surviving member of the generation of criminals who had built the national crime syndicate during the 1930s and had changed organized crime from simple violence into sophisticated business enterprise. The criminal groups that Meyer had helped create continued to operate after his death, but they were smaller, less sophisticated, and more open to law enforcement pressure than the empire he had built during his prime. Perhaps more importantly, the social and economic conditions that had enabled Meyer's success. Widespread political corruption, limited law enforcement capabilities, and public acceptance of certain types of illegal activity had changed dramatically during the 1960s and 1970s. Meyer Lansky's death ended one of the most remarkable criminal careers in American history. From his arrival as an 8-year-old immigrant at Ellis Island to his death as one of the wealthiest and most powerful criminals in America, his life spanned the complete development of modern organized crime. But Meyer's legacy went beyond his criminal achievements. His organizational methods, his financial innovations, and his strategic thinking had influenced not just criminal enterprises, but also legal businesses that adopted techniques he had started. More controversially, Meyer's career had shown both the opportunities and the dangers that American society presented to ambitious people who were willing to work outside legal boundaries. His success had been possible because of American freedoms and economic opportunities. But his methods had also damaged institutions that were essential to keeping those freedoms and opportunities for others. The moral complexity of Meyer Lansky's life and career continues to interest people more than 40 years after his death. He was simultaneously a criminal and a patriot, a corrupter of democratic institutions and a product of democratic freedoms, a sophisticated businessman and a user of simple violence. Understanding Meyer Lansky requires facing basic questions about American society, American values, and the relationship between success and morality in a competitive capitalist system. These questions remain important today as new forms of organized crime appear and as legal businesses use increasingly sophisticated methods to avoid legal and ethical rules. Meyer Lansky's story is ultimately an American story, a tale of immigrant success achieved through intelligence, determination, and moral compromise. It is a story that shows both the promise and the dangers of a society that rewards success without always looking at the methods used to achieve it. As we reach the end of Meyer Lansky's extraordinary story, we're left with deep questions that go far beyond the life of one criminal. No matter how sophisticated or successful he may have been, what does Meyer Lansky's life tell us about the American dream? Here was an immigrant boy who arrived at Ellis Island with nothing but intelligence and determination, who built one of the most successful business enterprises in American history, who gathered wealth that matched that of legal industrialists, and who used influence that reached into the highest levels of government. By normal measures, Meyer Lansky achieved remarkable success. But that success was built on activities that damaged democratic institutions, hurt innocent people, and broke basic moral rules that most Americans claim to value. The conflict forces us to face uncomfortable truths about American society. The same economic freedoms and political institutions that enabled legal success also created opportunities for criminal enterprise. The same cultural values that celebrated entrepreneurship and individual achievement also accepted corruption and violence when they served profitable ends. Meyer's story also shows the growth of American organized crime from simple street gangs into sophisticated business enterprises that worked in partnership with legal institutions. The techniques he developed for money laundering, political corruption, and organizational management became standard practices that continue to affect both criminal enterprises and legal businesses today. But perhaps the most troubling part of Meyer Lansky's legacy is what it suggests about the relationship between intelligence and morality. Meyer was certainly one of the most intelligent criminals in American history. But his intelligence was used for activities that ultimately made American society less safe, less honest, and less democratic. His life raises basic questions about whether intelligence without moral limits is eventually destructive, and whether societies that reward success without checking methods can last over the long term. The mystery that surrounded Meyer at his death, the location of the hundreds of millions of dollars that law enforcement agencies believed he had hidden, remains unsolved more than 40 years later. FBI agents continued searching for his hidden wealth long after his death, but they never found the offshore accounts, secret investments, or buried treasure that they believed existed. Perhaps the money never existed in the amounts that law enforcement estimated. Perhaps Meyer's wealth was always less than his reputation suggested. Or perhaps it was lost through bad investments, legal expenses, and the costs of keeping his criminal organization going during decades of law enforcement pressure. Or perhaps Meyer Lansky was even more sophisticated than his investigators realized, creating financial hiding places that were so clever and so well hidden that they remain undiscovered to this day. And so the story of Meyer Lansky drifts into the shadows of time, a man who built empires not with bullets, but with numbers and quiet deals behind closed doors. His name, like so many others of that era, became both legend and warning, a reminder of how power can rest not only in violence, but in patience, calculation, and silence. As the city sleeps, his story lingers, soft as the smoke of a fading cigar in the night. Thank you for joining me in this quiet journey through history. If this story helped you relax, drift off, or simply discover something new, don't forget to leave a like. Share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe for more sleepy gangster stories. Until next time, rest well and good.